We're hoping that when we fire the gun to find out how effective these things would have been on the battlefield.
When these things were made, this was more or less of a state secret. There wasn't a great deal written down about it.
With a muzzle-loading gun, the opportunities for lethal error are numerous.
Fireworks, with their colourful displays of glittering flashes and explosive bangs, lie at the heart of the story of artillery. Traditional fireworks are still made today in Japan, just as they have been for centuries. The discovery of the formula for making gunpowder, from saltpeter, sulphur and charcoal, originally came from China in about the 9th century AD, when it was used, much as it is today, to amuse and entertain on special occasions. What's striking about these modern fireworks is their construction. They are made exactly like miniature bombs, packed full of gunpowder pellets with a separate gunpowder charge to provide the bang. When the two sides have been taped together, the explosive mixture is completely enclosed in a thin shell. The shells are just strong enough to hold the contents together. To launch the firework, a small gunpowder charge is placed at the bottom of a tube. Next, the firework. The procedure is very similar to loading a large cannon. But 1,000 years ago, there were no cannon. The military potential for the tightly packed gunpowder mixture shot from a tube had yet to be fully appreciated. When did gunpowder move from an innocent display to a weapon of destruction? Evidence is scant, but the destructive force of gunpowder appears to have been first understood in Europe at the beginning of the 14th century. At the beginning of the 14th century, nearly 700 years ago, a new sound thundered across the battlefields of Europe, the sound of gunpowder shot from guns. Big guns, artillery, were to come to dominate the battlefields and oceans of the world, but to begin with they made relatively little impression. Why was this? How is it that such a formidable weapon, so much more powerful than anything known before, took so long to perfect? Here, in a manuscript produced in 1326 for the education of the young King Edward III of England, we see perhaps the first illustration of a cannon, unusually vase-shaped and shooting an arrow. To find some answers to our questions, we decided to build one.
Well, we decided to build this cannon because it's one of the earliest illustrations of a piece of artillery known in Europe. It's a very small illustration, so we can't tell very much from it. We don't even know, of course, whether it's an illustration of a real thing that worked or whether it's something fanciful made up by the artist. Now, the only way to find out is to make one and see if it really does prove to be an effective weapon.
It was a slow and complex process. First, the patterns were turned and shaped from wood, their size based on the calculated dimensions of the cannon taken by eye from the medieval illustration. When assembled, the patterns formed the outer vase-like shape of the cannon. The three pattern elements were designed to make the bronze casting process easier. There was the base of the cannon, the middle section, and the muzzle. Our problem was guessing what the inside, the barrel and the powder chamber was like.
We have no idea how the interior of this cannon would have worked. The illustration gives us no idea, and there are different theories about how it would have been formed inside.
Taking a two-dimensional medieval drawing, really the only one we have, and trying to turn that into the three-dimensionality, both the external shape and the internal shape, causes quite a lot of problems. And of course, you know, we all bring different interpretations to that about exactly how this might work.
The completed pattern waited for casting until all the various opinions on the casting process had been explored. The rear of the cannon had to be thick enough to contain the explosion of the gunpowder charge safely. A straight, narrow bore would be the safest option, but would it accurately reflect the original illustration?
In my view, from that little picture, I tend to bring my knowledge or opinions of medieval architecture. One of the things that people always say about the great cathedrals is that they were designed from the inside out, and that the outside form, despite all the pinnacles and buttresses and so on, is really just the engineering around the liturgical inside. It's a big jump from there to a gun, but it could be that we're dealing with the same kind of medieval mind here. So from that premise, I'm arguing that the inside form of this gun actually reflected or followed to some extent the outside form.
The debate over the interior shape, either a tube with a large chamber or just a tube, was finally settled in favour of the simpler option.
And we've in the end gone for a straight bore for this one to take the arrow which this gun would have fired. That's a decision we've taken, and maybe we're wrong. Maybe in the end we'll find with our testing, it's what this is about, and our trials, that actually it doesn't work in that way, and we'll have to develop it further.
The vase cannon was finally prepared for casting. The first two patterns were placed upright in a specially constructed iron container filled with sand and then smoothed down. The sand takes the shape of the outside of the cannon. The final section, the pattern for the muzzle, was fitted and more sand added. Research in the early stages had tried to find out how the cannon would have been made in the Middle Ages, but this proved too difficult to copy. So instead, modern foundry techniques were used to speed up the process and keep the costs down. The sand was hardened, and once set, the patterns carefully removed. Of course, the exact metal composition of the original bronze cannon was unknown, but analysis of another early cannon showed a mix that included 92% copper and 6% tin. The finished cannon would weigh about 450 kilograms, so over 500 kilograms of bronze was fed into the furnace and heated to over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Pouring the large quantity of bronze was another problem. Too fast and the mould chokes. Too slow and the metal solidifies too soon, causing cracks. Evaluating the success of the casting had to wait until after the long cooling period. Then, at last, the sand was knocked away. On first inspection, everything seemed to have gone according to plan, but it was designed to be shot, and that would be the ultimate test. To us, the bore seemed out of proportion.
It looks a very small bore. If it was just firing a little ball, you'd wonder whether it was worth the bother.
Yeah, exactly, but illustration shows it firing what is called in the manuscripts a garrow, the large flighted arrow, and we do have this account from 1342 of all the bits and pieces that came together to make this. The bronze flights, the steel head, the oak shaft. Of course, we don't exactly know how it was put together because it doesn't tell us that, but it tells us all the components. And this, of course, would have fitted in to the bore like that, and that's what we've gone deep into the bore like that.
The arrow does look about the right size, and it seems very similar to the kind of arrow that must have been fired by those great crossbows, or the springall, the sort of predecessor, throwing a dart rather than a round or spherical projectile.
We're hoping that when we fire the gun to find out how effective these things would have been on the battlefield. And we're only going to know that when we try it. It took quite a long time for artillery to come to dominate the battlefield. Now, why was that? We already know from our experiences of trying to cast this that it's difficult, it's time-consuming, and it's expensive. Therefore, these things weren't around in large quantities to begin with? Is that the only reason? Is the reason that these were too small and you had to be able to construct something bigger? Or is it that they weren't on the battlefield any more effective, really, than the other weapons around at the time? We need to understand that if we're to understand why it took so long for artillery to become the dominant force in warfare, which it eventually did.
It is under there somewhere.
Our moment of truth had arrived. On a range on the Essex marshes, the first replica Vase cannon ever built was being prepared for its big test, its first firing. The biggest uncertainty was the amount of powder to use, a problem made much more difficult because modern gunpowder is different from and more powerful than its medieval equivalent. Unfortunately, we don't yet understand by how much. Too much powder would damage the cannon and the arrow, and too little would be ineffective. We made our calculations and erred on the side of caution. Too little would be better than too much to begin with.
You know that this early gun fired an arrow, but we've had to work out how to put the flights on the arrowhead, pierce the cartridge with the bent pricker, and then
the first shot would be fired with just 50 grams of powder, equivalent to the charge of a heavy musket.
It was done with a red hot.
Even so, this first firing would leave nothing to chance. On a fully equipped range, we could detonate the charge electronically, with the team well protected at a safe distance, and we could record the result using high-speed cameras. What you're going to see has, quite literally, never been seen before. The order is given, the charge ignites. That 50-gram charge has done its job and sent the arrow flying out of the muzzle. The gun works, and works well. What was its range? Indications from our first firings suggested about 50 metres point blank, about half that of a musket at the time of the Duke of Wellington. But this gun threw a large arrow, not a small lead ball. It must have been a formidable weapon.
Did it arrive in one piece?
Yeah.
Break up on impact? It
so.
didn't
Think
break
so.
before it got here.
Yes.
I don't know.
I think that's what I think.
Yeah,
Bent
I think
the arrow
so.
beautifully.
Well,
The whole, then the shaft just went. Yeah, the shaft just went to smash in, and there's the remains of the flight.
Yes, which the
Just like a bonking curling up,
broke,
isn't it?
Yeah.
the flights have
Just-
overtaken
Yeah,
it,
just
where
gone
they come
straight on.
round.
Yeah. Right, let's get it in.
After that first test, we decided to see what would happen with somewhat larger charges of powder.
That's what I wanted, just clear. That's what
We went back to our original idea and tried 3 flights rather than the 2 we had used for the first tests.
Red hot.
Then the arrows had not flown entirely true.
Having to-
We wanted to see if we could do better.
and that's it.
That's ready to go.
Ready to go.
The fuse had been set to burn for around 14 seconds to give everyone time to take cover. This firing, too, appeared to be a success. But what had happened to the arrow and how far had it travelled? It was just a matter of finding it in the long grass.
Ah, found a piece. I've just got the broken head, Nick.
Is that the one that goes with the shaft, though?
I don't know. It looks like it might be.
Which was which now? Well, this bit was dead in line with the
So
the
it
gun.
flies fairly true.
So it
and then,
seems to.
do you think it broke up on impact or broke up before in flight because of the charge?
This seems to me to have been a thump as it hit the ground, which may be
Yeah.
what sent that sideways. Because as I say, this was right in line. But the interesting thing is about the shaft. We have got this powder burning,
Yeah.
and this bit isn't even in the gun, of course.
Yeah, you're
so
right,
there's
yeah.
an implication that a lot of the gas and
Yeah.
burning gases come past
Come
the arrow
forward, yeah.
before it's got clear of the gun. So the wadding may not be quite good enough, but we're
Yeah.
still getting decent range.
About-
And very much in line with the gun, so it
Yeah,
wouldn't do you any
100
good.
yards?
Yeah, it must be.
The arrow had gone twice as far as the first arrow shot with a smaller charge, but the extra force had broken the arrow as it left the gun. Do these results help to answer any of those questions about why these early guns took so long to make a real impact? Well, perhaps. Our test showed that the Vase cannon was a very practical weapon, but a weapon of limited range and power. It may have been the equal of the big siege crossbows of the time that were doing the same job, but it may not have been their superior. Not yet, at any rate. But the art and science of gunpowder artillery was set to advance rapidly. By the early 15th century, the secrets of the professional cannon master were being written down. This book shows the making of gunpowder and incendiaries. The writer was a new breed of highly skilled gunner, conducting sieges with a weapon now an essential part of the military arsenal. But in these early years, the effectiveness of artillery is unclear. Most early guns were probably too small to make any real impact on thick stone walls, and the gunners who had to load and fire at close range were easy targets for archers and crossbowmen, as this illustration of the dangers of the gunner's life clearly shows. Working with the new gunpowder artillery was a hazardous, complex and highly specialised branch of warfare. Not only did gunners have to know how to work the new weapons, but they also had to be expert in handling gunpowder mixtures and to know how to measure and mix them. Guns during this period were often made from wrought iron with removable powder chambers and were mounted on increasingly sophisticated carriages. Gunpowder was loaded into the chamber, and there were usually several chambers for each gun. This early 15th century siege cannon shows how far the simple Vase cannon had progressed in a matter of 60 or so years. The demand for bigger and better artillery grew as more commanders began to appreciate its value as a siege weapon. During this period, the siege was a far more common form of warfare than fighting on a battlefield. The problem with sieges was they tied up the besieging army's men and equipment for months on end. The advantage of big guns was to speed up the siege process considerably by damaging stone defences. Gunpowder artillery quickly transformed siege warfare. This massive Turkish stone-throwing cannon, or bombard, demonstrated just how large they'd become just over a century after the Vase gun was made.
Here we have a gun that can throw a granite ball weighing 670 pounds, enough to destroy the strongest city wall. The gun was cast in two parts, and this is still a bit of a mystery to us. The fact that each half weighs 8 tons is perhaps the clue, though. It would need to be cast in two parts because the amount of metal to melt was so gigantic. It's probable that there's no foundry today that could make such a gun, and foundrymen that have visited and seen it have remarked that it's an absolute feat of medieval technology. Whether cast in two parts, it was then left screwed together, or whether it was treated as a kind of breech loader. It would take a lot of effort to unscrew it, but that would give you the advantage that you could load the gunpowder into the chamber more easily. And there was a lot of gunpowder. It was well over 300 pounds of powder. The rate of fire was probably about 16 rounds a day, so there would have been time to unscrew it.
The great Turkish gun was so successful that it was still in use in the 19th century, some 400 years after it was built, in a fortress defending the Dardanelles, the narrow seaway that separates European from Asian Turkey. As warfare began a slow process of change, gunpowder artillery began to make its influence felt on the battlefield. By the 17th century, heavy, almost immobile siege guns were no longer practical. They could take months to be moved a few miles, and hundreds of men and animals to transport them. What was needed was a lighter, wheeled gun that could be moved quickly into position. In the English civil wars of the 1640s, artillery was being used in conjunction with massed infantry using muskets and pikes. The changes in gunpowder weapons went hand in hand with changes in other weapons, tactics and strategy. This was the age of the artillery manual, written to teach soldiers and their leaders. Now, guns were usually manned by trained and disciplined men. Those men were the new fighting force on the battlefield, skilled and knowledgeable. Men who could load, prime and fire their guns safely and efficiently. The charge, ball and straw wadding were loaded systematically from the muzzle using special tools and rammed home tightly. Once loaded, the gun was carefully aimed using a sighting ruler, and the gunpowder charge loaded in the breech of the barrel. Then the priming vent was cleared with a pricker and a small amount of powder poured in. Only then was the gun ready to fire. The guns were relatively quick firing, but really rapid fire was impossible. After each round, the gun was laboriously moved back into position. The recoil always moved the gun several feet. Repositioning and re-aiming the gun after each round was made a little easier with a larger gun crew. This reenactment shows the lengths to which the French army under Napoleon carried out its craft with practiced efficiency. Napoleon really understood artillery, and La Garde Impériale was his crack unit.
Gunnery is a craft all of its own, and it's very important that gunners are well trained. Now, Napoleonic gun detachments would have had a number of trained soldiers on them, probably assisted by people who weren't as well trained. The most important figure is what we would now call the number one on the gun, who supervises the rest of the detachment. And here we're looking at collective skills which you have to practice, which you have to get absolutely right. Because with a muzzle-loading gun, the opportunities for lethal error are numerous.
La Garde Impériale used mathematicians to calculate the complicated aiming procedures. The type of ammunition, wind direction, range and size of charge were all important considerations. The loading drill was strictly ordered and supervised. Each man had a particular duty and responsibility for other members of the crew.
If you're ramming the charge home, while there are any burning particles of wadding or the previous charge still in the barrel, the gun will go off prematurely. And if it does, the probable result is that the man with the rammer will lose both his arms. So a simple error in gun drill could be absolutely lethal. These people really needed to get their act together.
These French guns were technically innovative too. They were cast solid and then bored out, a technique that produced a stronger, more reliable cannon.
The uniforms may look smart, and the gun drill may be slick, but there really is something particularly dreadful to crewing a Napoleonic field gun on a battlefield. It's very noisy, it's smelly, the gun produces clouds of powder smoke, fouling from the black powder gets everywhere. If you're not careful and you don't stand away from the piece when it's fired, the wheels bound back over your feet. So you're in great danger of getting smashed limbs from the gun itself. You're also not going to make yourself hugely popular with the folk opposite. So if your position is actually taken by assault, by infantry or by cavalry, your prospect of surrendering to people that you've been hammering away at for the last few minutes is decidedly poor.
The field gunner needed discipline and the courage to stay with his gun during waves of heavy enemy fire. And so did the gunner on a sailing ship. This is a sailing replica of an early 17th century European ship. It's well armed and capable of defending itself. Ships like this allowed European countries to develop trading empires and colonies around the world. However, the technical innovations that made this possible come from an earlier period, when guns and ships were changing fast. To understand how cannon made for use on land were adapted for use at sea, and how ships were altered to allow them to be used successfully, we must go back to the time of King Henry VIII. In 1545, Henry's great warship the Mary Rose sailed out of Portsmouth harbour with the rest of the English fleet to do battle with the French. Instead, it capsized and sank. The discovery and raising of this ship has answered many obvious questions and posed some unexpected ones. The ship was heavily armed with cannon. But how effective were they? Could they really destroy an enemy ship? This is a working replica of a Tudor cannon copied from an original gun recovered from the wreck of the Mary Rose. Like many medieval siege cannon, it's made of wrought iron, and like both earlier and later field guns, it's mounted on a carriage with two large wheels to allow it to be moved around easily on land. It's not adapted for use at sea, so how effective was it? It was to answer this question that we decided to build and fire a replica. The decision was taken here in the offices of Chris Topp, an experienced blacksmith. We discussed the construction of the cannon using working drawings based on measurements taken from an original gun.
The breech is a different matter, though.
There were a number of technical problems to overcome during the construction process, which we discussed in detail.
Cut in half, that would be handy.
Yeah.
Many guns of the period were cast in bronze, but guns like this one continued to be made by hand out of wrought iron, an apparently outdated technology even in the early 16th century. Why had Henry VIII, a keen modernizer, persisted with such an old-fashioned method? The barrel was made up from a number of long wrought iron staves, each one individually heated and beaten carefully into shape. These would form the inside of the barrel.
Well, there's been a lot of debate about why wrought iron guns were so prevalent. Nobody has fully understood, I think, why things which appear to be very crude were obviously so successful.
The 9 individual staves were mounted onto a wooden core and held tightly in position with a temporary clamp. A modern solution, as there are no records of how the gun was originally constructed.
It's never been done, as far as we're aware, for 300 years, to put a cannon together of this sort as such a perfect replica and to work. It's a job of work to find out how you do these things and to do them successfully. And after all, the people that made them in the first place were only blacksmiths, and we're blacksmiths, so there can't be too much of a problem.
A succession of hoops and bands were used to keep the barrel staves in place. Each one would be made to fit exactly one against the other to cover the entire length of the barrel. The hoops and bands were made from iron bars, and after heating, each is painstakingly bent into shape. Wherever possible, the team tried to use the same techniques and equipment as Tudor craftsmen. Hammer welding is a particularly difficult technique to get right. To fuse the two ends together, they had to be hammered at exactly the right temperature. The next stage, after raising the barrel vertically, was to fit the hoops and bands. First, the sighting ring, positioned at the front of the gun's muzzle, was hammered into place.
The red-hot hoops and bands expand just enough to be fitted over the staves. On cooling, the metal contracts and binds the barrel tightly together.
Don't forget that when these things were made, this was more or less of a state secret. There wasn't a great deal written down about it, because I suppose with all armaments, any developments were kept under wraps as far as possible, and that may be why there is so little documentary evidence about how these things were made and used.
The hot hoops and bands are carefully shaped and their size adjusted so that they'll eventually fit tightly together over the length of the barrel. Constant measuring to ensure a good fit was very time-consuming. Too much heat and hammering and the hoop stretches. Too little and the hoop won't contract enough to grip the barrel. Occasionally, modern machines had to be used to keep the demanding schedule on course for the important test firing, but they were only used as a last resort. It's known from a few records of the time that some Tudor smiths were already using water-powered trip hammers to help them with their heavier forging work. Gradually, the barrel was taking on a recognizable shape as the number of hoops and rings increased. Some helped into place with a lot of physical effort before being cooled to seal the staves in position. The tight fit ensures the gun barrel is strong enough to withstand the explosive force released on firing. The finished replica of Henry VIII's cannon was transported to the firing range. This was the crucial test. Was this type of gun really effective against the thick wooden hulls of enemy ships? The gun was a breech loader, and the wrought iron breech block was first loaded with gunpowder. At this first firing, the amount of powder was very much a matter of guesswork. The breech block was a very innovative development when it was first introduced in the early 15th century. Rather than load the gun with powder and shot down the barrel, as had been traditional, breech blocks allowed the gun to be loaded at the other, safer end of the gun. Several could also be loaded in advance and rapidly reloaded during action, giving a faster rate of fire. The breech block was packed with sawdust and a hay wadding before the end was sealed with a wooden bung. The first test was firing lantern shot, a wooden canister filled with stones, anti-personnel ammunition. A large area of timber was covered with paper to judge the spread of shot. When the lantern shot had been loaded, the next stage was to lift the breech block into place. The block was very heavy and took 4 people to lift it. This was interesting as it was believed that Tudor gun crews probably needed more people. A major problem with early breech blocks was to ensure a gas-tight fit between the base of the barrel and the neck of the breech block. In this sort of gun, the problem was solved by wedging the block with a forelock, a large section of wood, and finally with an additional metal wedge.
I've just got to make it ring. It'll probably go down a bit further because we... It rang then. Yes, good. Yeah.
The gun was trained with the help of a wooden support and cross pin, and aimed using the simple sight fitted on the end of the muzzle.
On the side of the gun.
The gun was primed and fired electronically. The paper had been torn to shreds. Hardly surprising, but the damage to the timbers underneath was far greater and more extensive than had been anticipated. Fragments of stone and pebble were deeply embedded in the wood and over a very wide area. This would have caused certain death to any unprotected sailor. Next, an original stone ball from the Mary Rose was to be fired directly at the thick wooden timbers. The target was based on the design of a Tudor ship's side. How would an old-fashioned wrought iron cannon perform against a much more difficult target, solid oak? The gun was aimed at the centre of the thick wooden target. A larger charge was used to propel the heavy stone ball. The result was far more impressive than we'd thought possible.
Cracking the wood.
Yes, it's impressive from the front.
And it's gone right the way through.
To the back.
Oh my word! On the side of the ship.
The test showed why this type of gun was still used in Henry's navy.
No,
It was an effective anti-personnel weapon, and it could severely damage ships.
What about the ball? It's almost intact. No, it's not intact. No, half a ball. It's looked intact. Back up.
Drop it before it moves the ball.
So what distance have you got now?
I wonder if
I'm on
that
10 metres.
Ironically, it may have been the very success of these guns that was their downfall. During Henry's reign, there seems to have grown a demand for putting more and more cannon on warships. This was achieved by one simple but clever adaptation. Holes were cut in the ship's side, protected by hinged covers. These gun ports allowed guns to be fired from the lower decks, massively increasing the firepower of the ship. But in the confined spaces below deck, the big wheeled carriages used on land must have been difficult to work. The answer was another simple but very important development, the truck carriage. Specially designed for use on board ship, these carriages usually had 4 small wheels instead of 2 big ones. After firing, they were easily pulled inboard for reloading. Slick drill ensured that a cannon could be loaded, fired, cleaned and reloaded in a matter of minutes. The addition of 4 small wheels and the gun port changed naval tactics forever. Now ships could bring to bear immense firepower. The guns that were put onto these new carriages were not usually the wrought iron ones that we now know were so effective, but cast bronze guns. These were certainly no cheaper to produce, so what was their advantage? To find out, we once again decided to make and test a replica of one of the guns recovered from the Mary Rose.
A bronze gun cast in one dramatic volcano of molten metal. But before this, there had been much painstaking work. First, specialists from the Morris Singer foundry took moulds from one of the guns recovered from the gun deck of the Mary Rose. These were used to create a full-size model of the gun in wood and fiberglass. A craftsman puts the finishing touches to the wooden breech end of the model. Each part of the model shows the form and decoration of the original perfectly, an exact copy to create a perfect replica. Just as in the reign of Henry VIII, this model was then used to form a complex hollow mould, ours made of sand. The mould is split into a number of sections for ease of handling. All are carefully inspected, cleaned and made ready. Then the parts are moved with great care within their protective steel tubes to the casting pit, where they will be joined together. Carefully they are lifted into the vertical. Sealing compound is applied to make a perfect joint, and the parts are joined together. Then the whole mould is gently and carefully lowered into a pit for the next stage. To form the bore of the gun, a core is inserted down the mould and held in the correct position by spacing pieces. It was made of hard casting sand formed into a perfect cylinder around a steel rod to ensure the bore is straight. Taylor's historic bell foundry in Loughborough dug a pit specially in order to cast the barrel in the traditional way, vertically, breech down, so that any air bubbles and casting flaws would be at the muzzle end of the gun, where strength was less important. With the mould finally in position for casting, metal ingots are uncovered, moved to the furnace, and dropped in to heat and melt, a lengthy process. At last, the mould and the molten bronze are ready. The casting can begin. It's a worrying moment. If the mould is not perfectly dry, it could explode. Will the casting be a success? The glowing liquid metal is poured in, and it's vital that the molten bronze flows into every part of the mould. The pour is over. When cool enough, the barrel and mould, weighing more than 2 tons, are slowly lifted from the casting pit. The steel shell is unbolted and then literally shaken to free the casting from the mould. Gradually, little by little, the sand crumbles. One end of the gun is uncovered as the mould and casting are lowered to the floor. The fire-hardened sand around the breech is knocked off to reveal the intricate mouldings of the original. Finally, the mould and casting are lifted and shaken again. The sand mould collapses. A gun is born. As soon as it's cool enough, the casting is cleaned up. Hard, slow, painstaking work to reveal every detail of the original 16th century gun. Old tools, modern tools, muscle power and skill all combine gradually to reveal our new Mary Rose cannon. At last, the gun is finished. Mounted on a replica carriage made by specialist carpenter Jim Sadler, it's ready for its big test. It's intended to fire a solid cast iron ball weighing about 10 kilos.
A bit more. Move up a step. The coin out a bit.
Is that better?
The first loading begins. The range we're using at Shoeburyness on the Essex marshes witnessed many important artillery trials during the 19th century, when rifled artillery was replacing smoothbore guns descended from the cannon we're about to test.
When you're ready.
We're trying to find out how well the bronze muzzle loader performs compared with the wrought iron breech loader that we fired previously.
Put in your shots. Put up your shots.
Every care is taken. The safest way to load the gun is as it would have been done in Tudor times, and that's what we try to do. The first test firing uses a small charge. We'll build up the power gradually by using bigger charges. The first shot is fired. The gun has passed its initial test. Even with a small charge, the power unleashed from the gun is awesome. Filmed by a high-speed camera that turns a second into a minute, the ferocity of the explosion can be seen in all its terror as smoke and flame belch from the gun and throw the ball at enormous speed. The next shot, too, was comparatively low in power, but it punched a neat hole through the thick oak of the replica ship's side. The effect on the target interested the whole team. That ball seemed to have gone through and carried on without even noticing the thick oak planks.
I think it's unbelievable. It looks like somebody's got a drill and bored it through.
It's an amazing clean hole.
It's fantastic.
I'm delighted we've hit the target.
Well, where did you aim? Just to the left?
Well, we were aiming a bit further to the left, because it's not bad. It's not bad. Let's see.
I wouldn't like to be stood there, would you? When that came through.
Look, it's glanced off a frame.
Yeah.
It's just unfortunate it's gone to the area which was hit by the stone shot before, hasn't it? And glanced a frame.
Just still a lot of splinters.
Where's the shot?
The shot went left.
Splinters going off into the distance.
The shot shot over there to the left somewhere. It came out, and as it hit here, I think it went over there.
Further tests showed the true power of this weapon. It could propel an iron ball at supersonic speeds to well over a mile. No ship and no sailor was safe from a weapon like this. It was the innovation in gun and ship design that occurred in the reign of Henry VIII that was to lead to the rapid expansion of European influence in the world. Let us move forward some 80 years. Here was a rich ship, decked out with superb carvings and opulent fittings. It breathed confidence and assurance from every angle. This was a Dutch East Indiaman. It carried a nation's pride and announced its growing influence in the world. And below decks, there were formidable guns capable of dominating a sea battle with ease. One of the most striking features of this merchant ship is the number of guns it carries. 32 pieces of heavy artillery, a formidable concentration of firepower, greater than in many armies. When the Duke of Wellington fought the French in Spain nearly 200 years later, he had no more cannon with him than are on board this ship. And he had an army of over 30,000 men. And the Batavia isn't even a warship. It's a merchantman with a big punch. The Batavia was a superb example of Dutch enterprise and commercial flair. Today, the guns are loaded and fired by a team drawn from the Batavia Museum's staff. The naval innovations of the 16th century, the truck carriage and the gun port, now played an important role in the Dutch merchant fleet of the 17th century, whose ships sailed the busy trade routes that stretched around the globe. It's ships like this that helped European countries come to dominate world trade. And it's not difficult to see why. If this sailed into your harbour, you'll be most unwise not to do business with those on board. The original Batavia had sunk on her maiden voyage off the coast of Australia in 1628. But ships like her spread European influence around the world in the 2 centuries that followed. During that time, the guns that made it all possible remained very much the same. They were powerful and reliable. And it wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that demands for longer range and greater accuracy changed artillery once more. By the time of the American Civil War, rifled muzzle-loading artillery was beginning to alter the face of battle forever. Here at Fort Nelson, the Royal Armoury's Artillery Museum near Portsmouth,
are housed guns that moved artillery technology far beyond crude casting and wrought iron. By the middle of the 19th century, the drive to build bigger and better guns had increased and new ways had to be found. One answer, the Armstrong gun, with a rifled barrel and exceptional range and accuracy.
For centuries, guns have been made of cast iron or cast bronze. By the 1850s, the limits of that technology had been reached.
In the Armstrong gun, the barrel had a rifled core around which were wrapped layers of interconnecting metal coils. They acted almost like a tight bandage, compressing the barrel and reinforcing it at the same time. The gun was a breech loader that worked. Improving technology ensured the breech was tightly sealed to prevent any gas leakage. It needed an enormous amount of gunpowder to produce the power to fire shells out of the tightly rifled barrel. But the result was a gun that could fire up to 2 miles and with reasonable accuracy. Guns like this were rewriting the rule book of warfare. The drill routines that accompanied the loading and firing sequences hadn't changed much since medieval times. Gunpowder was still a dangerous substance, even in the 19th century, and the same precautions always had to be taken, swabbing the barrel to extinguish any remnants of burning powder. The breech-loading system kept the gun crew away from the dangerous end of the gun, where they were often easy targets for enemy snipers.
There was no danger here for the gunners. The thick brick casemate gave a very solid protection.
Based on accurate gun tables, the target distance would be quickly assessed. Moving the gun back into position for firing after each recoil was still very hard work. Even in the age of steam and of developing hydraulic systems, a gun as advanced as this still had to be physically and laboriously levered into position, which inevitably slowed down the rate of fire, even with a highly trained and fit gun crew. But many minds were addressing this problem, and before the end of the 19th century, a more deadly and accurate field artillery had been developed, using technology that kept the gun in position, aimed at the target, even after constant and repeated firing.
The system used a huge cylinder filled with compressed air or hydraulic fluid to absorb the recoil.
Now, at last, the gun had achieved perhaps the ultimate objective. It could fire continuously, rapidly, and accurately at distant targets. By the beginning of the 20th century, the problems that had previously reduced the efficiency of artillery had all been solved. Big guns had become ferociously powerful weapons. The First World War has been aptly called the artilleryman's war. Battles were fought and many lives lost to gain the right ground from which big guns could attack the enemy with devastating effect. Artillery had become the greatest man-killer known in military history, a frighteningly efficient killing machine. And so, despite all the technological advances of the 20th century, despite all the new and powerful weapons that have been developed, nothing has yet superseded the big gun. HMS Belfast, the last survivor of the British fleet of the 1930s. Her 12 great guns enjoyed a particular advantage over land-based artillery.
The really great difference to all land-based weapons is there is no recoil, or very little recoil. Instead of the tremendous hydraulic recoil used on land-based artillery, the gun breech rolling back several feet on a large gun. Here we're talking about a matter of inches. The shock from the firing is carried through the ship's structure and then, of course, transmitted into the sea all around her. So they're carrying their hydraulics with them to some extent.
HMS Belfast was launched in 1938, saw action in World War II and for the last time during the Korean War in the early 1950s. Her Mark 23 guns remain very powerful and very impressive, their range well beyond the horizon.
The Mark 23 was certainly one of the best and the most reliable of the cruiser guns, the medium guns used by the Royal Navy or indeed any other navy during the mid-20th century. The advantage of the 6-inch projectile was that you could fire large quantities in a very short time, so very high rate of fire. The range of these guns, absolute maximum, was 14 miles. But to put that into perspective, our forward turrets in HMS Belfast are ranged on a target in northwest London, the Scratchwood Motorway Services Station on the M1, so we can hit any area of Greater London from our mooring here. These particular 6-inch guns were probably the final flowering of the old-style naval gunnery. By this time, it was getting pretty sophisticated. This turret here, 3 guns in each, a total crew of 27, with another 22 working deep down below, beneath heavy armour, operating the shell rooms and the magazines where the cordite charges were stored. None of these people had anything to do with the aiming and direction of the guns. That took place entirely elsewhere, beginning on right at the top of Belfast Bridge with the main battery director control tower.
HMS Belfast remains a nostalgic memory of an era of fast-moving, hard-hitting light cruisers. Most modern warships no longer carry heavy guns. They are armed with sophisticated missiles now. But the quest to build the biggest artillery piece was not forgotten. And at the end of the 20th century, someone just had to have one more go at constructing something even bigger and more powerful. So they built the supergun, and this is part of it. An almost medieval throwback. No wheels, a huge-barreled stationary monster, computer-designed, built from the latest and most expensive materials. How it would have performed remains a mystery, but it fulfilled one of the simple rules of artillery. Let metal do the business of war, not flesh.